Hello and welcome to SharpHR Career Corner with Karen Sharp Price. This podcast will inform and inspire you in your quest to find the right career path. If you're just starting out, looking to make a change in your field, or transitioning into a new career, then this podcast is for you. We will be sharing tips and providing resources on topics such as writing resumes, interviewing, using LinkedIn, and networking. We will take a look at different careers, companies, and opportunities. You will hear success stories from professionals in all career paths, and so much more. You will leave this podcast with 3 key takeaways that you can easily put into practice. Enjoy!
Welcome to SharpHR Career Corner podcast. Today, our guest is Whitney Sullivan. Welcome to the podcast, Whitney.
Thanks, Karen. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. So why don't we just jump right in? Why don't you start telling us about your own career story and how you sort of got to where you are today?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Whitney Sullivan. Like Karen said, I'm a motivational speaker and leadership coach based in Bozeman, Montana. But I started my journey at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. That's where I did my undergraduate work, and I got my undergraduate degree in dietetics. And I kind of just ended up in dietetics. Like many college students, I think I changed my major probably 3 times and wasn't totally sure what it was that I wanted to do. But I did have a secret ambition as a young child to be a motivational speaker. But, the thing is no kindergartner or college student raises their hand and says, I want to be a motivational speaker. I thought it needed to be something a little bit more clear cut. I thought entrepreneurs were just this mystical group of people that opened their own businesses. And so I ended up in dietetics because, I was always passionate about helping other people be at their best, helping other people be well and thrive. And I always loved leadership. I was always part of team sports. I loved team building. And so the health and wellness space ended up being a good fit for me at the time. And I actually ended up getting offered a graduate assistantship at campus recreation at the University of Nebraska as well. And it's kind of like an apprenticeship. I was able to pursue my master's degree, and I did my master's in higher ed leadership. And lo and behold, that was also a really good fit for me at the time. I got to dive more into leadership, more into student staff development, more into team training. I did a lot of fitness and wellness programming. And, at the time I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I think this is, the career I was looking for. It kind of had all those little bits and pieces that I really enjoyed. But 10 years in, lots of things kind of happened in a series of a few years. The department I was working in, I experienced a major crisis in the department involved with like its buildings and such, which is a story for another day. But and so we had this, this crisis, and it made like state news and everything. And then after that kind of got settled, the pandemic hit. And then we all experienced, 2020 and everything that came with it. And I think, part of our conversation today is kind of on that, people reevaluating, what's next for them and how much that life changed. And so then the pandemic kind of ended, and then we're still dealing with the aftermath of some of the crises that happened with new building projects and such. And, I just found myself really burnt out. And finding that I was just in a space where I needed to make a change, and what I was going to stick with, for, most of my career, I was like, I need to do something different. And so my sister is a leadership coach. She's great. And so she's 10 years older than me. And, she actually made the jump into entrepreneurship a few years before me. And she was running a clarity and confidence masterclass that helped you identify, what career you want to be in, and like, when you're just wanting to make a change. And in that process, I realized that I kind of wanted to expand, who a student was, and that all of my favorite experiences was helping students figure out what they wanted to do with their lives and helping them navigate their first leadership experiences. I loved managing people. I loved leading people. I would do executive retreats on campus. And, I had this person that went before me, and I was like, well, I can do that. And so then I ended up starting a side hustle. And then eventually 8 months later, that side hustle turned into full-time entrepreneurship in October of 2021.
Wow.
So I'm just a little over a year into being a full-time entrepreneur as a speaker and a leadership coach and a team builder. And, I never thought that I can't say maybe I never thought I would be here, but I definitely didn't think maybe this soon in my career.
Yeah.
But, it's been such a learning experience, and I've just really enjoyed it so far. And it's been, a really great decision. And that's why I'm here with you today.
Okay. Well, I think, you said a few things that like ring a bell for a lot of people. And one of them is the pandemic really stopped people in their tracks. And I was just saying this to somebody else today. We were moving so fast in our lives. Like we just, every day, every hour, we had something going on. We were just busy, moving from one side to the other. And then the pandemic hits, and you can't do a good portion of everything that you were doing. Everything stops. And up until that point, people may have been unhappy with what they were doing in their careers, but they didn't have time to get off the merry-go-round and try to see what else they could do, because they just couldn't imagine taking any time away from what they really were doing to spend on themselves. And so the pandemic really stopped everybody in their tracks, and people started thinking, I always wanted to, or I really don't like what I do, but what else could I be doing now? And I think, I know from my perspective and my clients, I am getting way more people right now who have hit that wall and said, I don't want to do this for the next 10, 20, whatever years. I want to do something that I actually enjoy, but I don't know what that might be. And so that's really interesting. I just think that is an awakening. And I think, honestly, I think we all needed that. We needed that shutdown because we needed time to think, time to reflect.
We couldn't hide from ourselves there for a while, right? Everything, when life slows down, sometimes things start to rise. And, and then if you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, like if you're an essential worker, you might have experienced the opposite, where you got to a point where you were working so much that you burnt out and you're like, okay, I can't do this. So you're totally right.
Absolutely.
We all experienced this moment of like, man, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, the job market is as an employee, is a job seeker's market. And I think people just had so many opportunities, that they could make a change. And then, we were talking before the podcast that, it was that, your options for remote or hybrid work also suddenly became, an option for people. And so it's just like, there were just so many doors, I think, that opened that I think people finally felt like, oh, I can choose. I have a choice. And that was, I think, a very empowering place for people to be.
Yeah. And I think they got some rest along the way. So then all of a sudden they had the energy to even think about what they could be doing. And it really, I think that there was just this surgence of people, also like nurses and teachers. Those are two areas that people have been coming to me saying, I don't want to do this anymore. It's just not worth it. And I think in one respect, it's sad because we need teachers and we need nurses. So for that to have such an impact on them that they're looking to change their lives, that's going to be, we're going to feel that impact in the next few years because of the numbers of people leaving those fields. But on the other side, I think that being true to yourself and finding that happiness and what you really enjoy doing has an impact on relationships. It has an impact on your health. It just changes everything, everything. So if someone's listening right now and they've been on the fence and not sure, this is the time. Like, this is the time to still do it, because even though we're sort of back to whatever this new norm is, I think we're a little bit slower still. We're not at the speed in which we were before the pandemic in our lives. We still kind of are slowing down. I mean, I know I find myself coming into the new year, I wasn't that thrilled as I was all those other years. Like I was like, we'll just take it slow that first week.
People are still very cautious, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think, we kind of went through this period of our life where all of a sudden no was the default. Like, no, we can't do a lot of these things. And I know I talked to a lot of people that they're just like, wow, I was doing way too many things. And then now, I've heard some of those same people say like, man, I'm just so much more cognizant and mindful of what I say yes to. And so I agree that we're a little cautious still. There's still a little bit more bandwidth to be had.
Yeah. And I actually think it's probably healthier for
Totally
us not to jump so much and be so available, I guess is the word, in our own lives and in work. Because I think that there were many people who felt like they were on call all the time and they didn't have a job that needed to be on call.
Absolutely.
So there's been a lot of change in organizations, in what they provide and what they offer to bring new people on. Company cultures are changing. There's just, everybody has had to really take stock of what their situation is, what they're getting out of it, what they want from it, and what can they do to change things moving forward for the better. So it's an interesting time. It really, I enjoy, every time somebody calls me and says I need some help. It's interesting to hear their career path and where they've come, and maybe not where they're going because they don't know at that point. But so how do you help, or how do you, I guess, lead the way in helping people figure out what is that unique purpose that they have? Because that could be A to Z. Like, where do you begin? Where do you start?
There's so many options, right?
Yeah, too many right now than ever before. If you can imagine it, you can make it happen.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and one of my first keynotes as a motivational speaker was a keynote called Passion to Purpose, where we talked about this and, how do we go through that process of identifying what our unique purpose is? And, I think just to kind of throw a definition out there so we're all on the same page of, what we're saying a purpose is. And, I think a purpose is kind of that overarching sense of what matters to you in life. And then also I'd say in terms of career, it's your unique combination of passions, values, and talents that you put into service of others. And so that's how I would define purpose. And folks will hear me say passions, values, and talents a lot. And now that we kind of have that foundation of what a purpose is, it starts with introspection. And a question that I like to ask in that keynote and in that passion to purpose training is just a really big picture question of, what difference do you want to make? And, if you assumed that resources are unlimited and you didn't care what anyone thought, what difference do you want to make in the world? What impact do you want to create? And what that big picture question does is it starts to kind of unearth words and phrases that start pointing you to your purpose and what your unique combination of passion, values, and talents might be. And then, other things that are important to consider is because, that still is a little ephemeral, right? Like it'll start pointing you in the right direction. You're going to start noticing things and seeing things, but, also it's like, what are you good at? What are your strengths? What do you really care about? And what are your top core values in your life that you want to bring into your work every day, that you want to put into service for other people? And so I think starting with some of those big picture introspective questions is really important, just to kind of, set your trajectory. But I think that kind of helps start pointing you in that right direction.
It's interesting that you say that, because the very first thing that I have my clients do is fill out forms. One is, what are your values? What do you value the most? And then what are your goals? And I have them do that in the beginning when there isn't a career on the table, when there isn't a job on the table, because when those things start to form, you get excited and you want to jump. and you forget what your goals were and what your values were because you're so excited about what's on the table that you just want to jump. And I think that when you talk to some people who take the job offer, and in 6 months later, they're like, well, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Well, it could be because they didn't really go back to really the foundation. What did they really care about? What do they really want? Where do they want to be? And I find that it's interesting. I was part of listening to a seminar recently, and the idea was that you start with the end goal in mind. So what is that goal? And then you work backwards so you know the steps that you need to take. It's a different mindset, don't you think?
Totally. And like that reverse engineering, I think, is so powerful. And because another question that I'll ask clients is, what do you want your day to look like? Like, what's an ideal day? And actually, I would say that was probably the number one question that got me into entrepreneurship was, just the flexibility, just the type of work that I was doing each day. I was like, oh, I think that looks a lot like being an entrepreneur. And it's just like from sun up to sundown, what do you want to be doing? What conversations do you want to be having? What decisions do you want to be making? And like, what are your struggles? Like, what's your preferred struggles that you're having? And I was surprised in my own experience to find that my ideal day, I never would have thought pointed me towards entrepreneurship. But all that to say that, like that reverse engineering process, I think, is really powerful, of identifying where you want to be or identifying who you want to be, and then working backwards from there.
Yeah. Because otherwise you are jumping to take steps that you're not sure what the outcome's going to lead to. And then you don't know if when you get there that it's going to reflect what your values and your goals are.
Absolutely.
So it really does make sense that it's you have more success. It's more powerful.
Right.
By doing it the other way.
It helps guide your decisions. So that way, like, you're always moving towards that end goal. And one of the more powerful coaching questions that I ask my clients is like, when they're kind of trying to decide like, do I do this or do I do that? I'm like, you know what? Which decision is going to advance the vision that you want to create? Like, which decision is going to help you move towards the end goal that you desire? And then they're like, oh, like it's this one, not this one. So that, again, that reverse engineering just gives you that kind of compass to point you in the right direction.
And I don't know if there's any research backing this or not, but I wonder if younger people tend not to know what that target is, what their career is going to be. And so they tend to, because, it is said that a lot of people, it's hard to keep them for more than a year or even a little less than a year. They're hopping, they're hopping, because really most of the time they haven't found what makes them happy. But I wonder how often they actually sit down and figure out what would make them happy. And then compare it to whatever that job offer is to see if those things will make them. And no one's going to get everything. No one's going to be able to check off all the boxes, but you really should be checking off more than not. When you're
sorry, I jumped in too soon there, but I think going off that is then what struggles you're willing to endure. Like when what that kind of end goal is, and that way we're not just hopping from jobs every time something goes, I don't know, goes the way maybe you don't want to. It's kind of like, no, what struggles are you willing to tolerate in order to move you towards that goal? And that was one of the more powerful questions I first faced. Actually, an author named Mark Manson, when I was in college and grad school, he talked about how our career successes are more defined by the struggles we're willing to endure, not the successes that we want. So when you're looking at manifesting that unique purpose, you also have to look at, so what kind of struggle does this mean I have to navigate? So like being entrepreneurs, now we navigate that uncertainty, right? It's not a steady paycheck every month to month, but what that offers is the flexibility that higher education didn't offer. And I'm married now, so that risk portfolio has balanced out, right? But all of those things, working towards your purpose is just a constant trial and error. And, purpose is much more of a process than it is a single event.
So you talked about manifesting. So say you have that purpose in mind, you know what your
Mhm.
target is, you know what that career, where you're
Mhm.
headed. So how does one manifest their unique purpose into that career?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you kind of have that, maybe a few sentences that describe that difference you want to make, a few sentences that might describe your unique combination of passions, values, and talents. From there, then you can focus, or also I would add that end goal that you're talking about, that reverse engineering of where you want to be. And you can have a little paragraph that maybe describes those three things. But then my first tip to take that to purpose into action is to focus on purpose as a process and not an end goal. And that the pursuit of your purpose in your career is a way of being. It's not a single one-time event. And James Clear is the author of Atomic Habits. And I love what he says. I quote him all the time on this exact quote. He says, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And so if working aligned with your purpose is a goal, then it's our systems that we have to look at to get us there. And your systems are your habits, and your habits become your autopilot, and your autopilot is what directly influences how we show up in the world and the results that we get. So when it comes to, taking that purpose into action, we have to identify those small daily actions that take that purpose into reality. So when I was in higher education, one difference I was really passionate about making was identifying students' positive blind spots. Because I think sometimes, especially in college, the things you're so good at, sometimes you're blind to because they're so natural to you. They're so inherent. They're so much a part of you. And so a habit I got into was giving as much strength-based feedback as possible. And I try to point out at every opportunity a unique strength that they had. And then, that habit leads to another habit. I then have to become a student of strength-based literature and emotional intelligence and personality profiles. And all of those little things start leading me down a path that now I'm doing that full time, right? But it started as a habit, right? And we have to identify those small actions that we want to make automatic from day to day that advance the difference that you want to make. So that's the first tip. I'm curious if you would add anything to that.
Well, I think that that's really interesting. And I think that by breaking it down, you have greater success, because sometimes when you look at something and it seems overwhelming, you don't even want to try. It sort of just sucks out that energy, and you don't know where to start. You don't know how to start. And it just seems too big to take on. So you just say, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. But if you're breaking it down into mini goals, as you complete each of those steps, you really start to build self-confidence.
Yeah.
The fact that you can do it, which then also helps with that mindset for manifesting what you want and having positive thoughts in your head instead of sort of those negative things that kind of creep up, like I can't do it, it's too much, I don't know how to get there. But as you make those little tiny steps and you actually succeed, you start to build that. It's almost natural. It's not something, that you're doing it on purpose, but you start to build your own self-confidence.
Yeah, it becomes a part of your identity. Those small actions that we take. Another thing James Clear says, he says, every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become. And it's so true, because our habits lead to our identities. And so, like in my case, I eventually really identified with that identity of being a mentor. And, that identity is what supported me in making a career change at one point into being a leadership coach. So,
okay. Now, when we were talking about, there's a lot of things here, like you have to find your purpose. You have to kind of look within and find out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are you willing to put up with to get there. And we were talking before we started the episode about affirmations versus manifestations. And I think that that's where it kind of fits in nicely, is many of us have not reached the goal that we want because of sometimes those negative things that are being said in our head. And we sometimes don't even know that we're saying it, because it's a pattern. I don't know off the top of my head, but isn't there so many times you have to do something in order to make it a habit? I don't know, 7 or more. There's a number.
Right.
That
Right.
You have to do something.
There's lots of literature out there, but it's kind of like whatever you focus or whatever you repeat, you strengthen. Right. So like if you keep repeating negative self-talk, you're going to then strengthen the results that come from that. Right. And then if you repeat positive self-talk, you're going to strengthen the results that come from that. And before the episode, we had that caveat of like, you can't just think your way into something, right? It's more like, how are you responding to the challenges that your environment brings? Like that's where your mindset becomes really powerful, because I'm sure you found working with clients making career changes that like that's really hard. It's painful. Like, that change is painful. And so how you navigate those challenges that are brought to you has a lot to do with your mindset. And are you going to grow through them, or are you going to kind of fall underneath the weight of those challenges? And that's where the affirmations versus manifestations dynamic, I think, comes in.
Yeah. And I think that it's, I don't know if it's hand in hand, but I think that in order to reach that target, you really do have to change that mindset. And you do that on a very slow basis by habits that you form that will then help you with affirmations, which will say, I can do this. I can do the next step, or I start to get excited about it as well.
Right.
So once you know what your purpose is, how do you manifest that into actual results? So we have the career and we're working our way towards that career.
Yeah.
But now,
absolutely.
How do you like cross the finish line?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, this is, probably not the perspective that people want to hear, but one that I found to be mostly accurate. And that is to embrace trial and error. I think sometimes, again, we've said a couple of times that, putting your purpose into action and getting that result isn't a one-time event. It's a process of trial and error. And, you're going to try, and then being open to each of those things being a learning experience. I mean, even in the first year of my business, I had a lot of trial and error of like, okay, this worked, this didn't, but even the errors were some of the best learning experiences that moved me forward. And again, I know that's not the motivational part people want to hear, right? Like just go out and try stuff. But if you go out and try stuff with that mindset of like, I think this could move me closer to my goal, and you're open to that learning experience, you're going to keep picking up skills that keep moving you in that direction. And then in all of that, we have to practice resilience. And, because it's a tough process going out there and making yourself vulnerable, putting yourself out there, learning things, maybe failing a few times, like that's going to take resilience. And so when I work with trainees, when I work with clients, we talk a lot about resilience and figuring out those small practices that keep you grounded, gritty, and growing towards your goal. So not, probably what people want to hear, but trial and error and being willing to go out and try things and take things with that learning mindset is just really powerful when it comes to moving towards a career that supports your purpose.
Absolutely, because it doesn't matter what that goal is and where you're headed. I don't know anybody at this point who's ever done it without a slip, without a fall, without a major issue or a minor issue. And I think that you appreciate it more. You have more gratitude as you're getting closer to it. And that day that you reach it and you feel like, I'm here, I'm not done, but I, I'm in the area now. I'm in the red zone.
Right.
So I think that and understanding that from day one, that there are going to be those moments along the way, and it's okay. And expect them so that it doesn't traumatize you and overwhelm you, so that you say, no, I'm not taking any more steps. That was enough for me.
Right.
So keep just being really open-minded, like you said, and be willing to learn along the way. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that you really learn more in the failures than you do in the successes. So
absolutely.
So you want that. It makes you grow as a human being, and it makes you move closer to that ultimate goal. So yeah, totally agree. So now, can you provide like 3 pieces of advice? Someone's listening right now who has been thinking about it since probably before COVID, that they wanted to make a change. It could be in career, it could be in family. I mean, it could be for any other, many, many reasons, but they're energized by our conversation. They want to try. So what types of things can they do to, in the next few months? Because I don't think, again, that this is not an overnight success. This takes time, takes effort. So what kind of advice would you give somebody to try to manifest what they want in a career and get them out of the, I wish I could, maybe I've always thought of, and kind of move them towards that.
That
goal.
I think one thing I would have someone start with is reflecting on what support do I need? And what does support look like for me in making this change that I'm dreaming and scheming about? And again, I'm assuming you've already thought about what difference you're going to make, how you can make those habits, how you can embrace trial and error and all that. So if you've gone through all of that introspection, that ideating, it's like then reflecting, what support do I need? What people and communities do I need to invest in that's going to help me make this change? Because, there's tons of stats out there about how, 90% of your success towards a goal is who you surround yourself with. And I think of that in a few different ways. One of the first things that I did when I needed to make a change is I reached out to a mentor. And I was like, I got to get some external help on this. I can't do this on my own. And then, so that's the first tip, is reach out to a mentor, reach out to a coach, and there's lots of free stuff out there, including this podcast. Right.
Yeah,
and I know
absolutely.
that you even have free career corners. Is that what you call them? Right?
Yeah. We just started this week, and it's a group of women getting together to support each other.
So number one, ask for support from a person, figure out who that is. Second is find a community, find a class, find a group that you can hop into. And I know something that made a big difference for me was taking a class with other people who were experiencing the same thing as me. And it made it feel not so isolating. I was just like, oh, there's other people thinking the same things as me and experiencing the same things. And, there's a Facebook group for everything. There's a class online for everything. There's groups out there and communities out there that want to support you. And then also, I think, too, when it comes to support and connections, you might need to turn down the volume on some voices that might not understand your need to change, or might not even support your need to change. When we make big changes in our life, there will be people who get defensive about it, or don't understand it, or just react strongly. And I think I was surprised by that personally. If I were to share a personal experience, I was surprised by the number of people how they responded to my career change. And that wasn't positive. I was like, what do you mean? I was just surprised. And so I think sometimes, you just need to turn down the volume on those intimate connections that maybe you can't distance yourself from, but are around you. We got to turn down the volume for a little while and focus on finding other voices that are going to uplift that change that we want to make. So really those three tips at the end there are just really your social support and your social investments, and where are you investing what people are you investing time and energy into?
It's very weird how, and it's almost like manifesting. So I'm just gonna throw this out here. But just today I wrote a blog, a post on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter about support systems and how people come in and out of your life at different times. And sometimes there's a reason for that, because they need to sort of push you or elevate you to the next step. And then they've done what they needed to do and they move on. But to have that support system that you can, most of the time they walk alongside of you, but sometimes they have to push you and sometimes they have to carry you. And it's okay, because it takes a village. And so we need to have people that we can bounce things off of. And I talk about how, if you can think of a leader that you really like, that you really respect, generally speaking, those leaders, if you look really closely, the people around them are the people that support them, that respect them, that will do anything for them. And that is why they're the leader that they are. Absolutely. Is because of the people. They don't get to be leader and get to be a well-respected leader on their own. Like they just don't climb the ladder and nobody, gets in the way in between. And so that's success. And I think that we as individuals need to have that same support system to
Absolutely.
help us. And so I think mentoring, finding groups and clubs and classes to expand our knowledge and be around like-minded people, which is what you were saying, can carry so much, because the people that are your friends that have known you for who you are today and the days in the, behind us, they are the ones that might be a little negative, maybe a little jealous that you're taking this chance, and that maybe that you can take this chance. So finding those people that don't know your history that will say, yeah, why not? You should come along and do this. You can have a balance of both, but
absolutely,
but you need some new people. You need some fresh people in there to kind of elevate you and be your cheerleader and support you in all the different ways. So I think that's all really great advice. And I hope that those that are listening today just take, one or two ideas. And if you've been thinking about it, been sitting on the fence, been thinking, gosh, I wish I could, or I should, just take a chance. Why not? What's it going to hurt? And like you said, you started a side gig and you cultivated that. And then it got to a point where, okay, I can now take this on full time. And that's not as scary. It's a little bit easier to manage and to handle and to balance. And so sometimes you don't have to, just like, thinking about what your goal is, breaking it down into steps, doing a side gig until you feel more confident, and then just it grows in front of you, like it all of a sudden is there, and you're like, how did that happen? Like
And
no,
sorry, I have one great question that you can ask to get started is that just what's one small action in the next hour that I can do to get started? And I'll never forget, this was such a big deal to me. I'm a very private person, very introverted, I love to speak and teach and all of that, but I remember this like really small step that was like a move in the right direction before I even started my side hustle, is I made my Instagram public instead of private. And I posted a story. That was like a big deal to me, but I was like, well, if I'm going to have a side hustle, I got to have an Instagram, I got to be posting the stories, So, think it's like, what's one small action I can take today or in the next hour that's going to move me towards that goal? And I will tell you, it took me 18 months, to go from, that point of like opening up my Instagram to public to making that jump full time. So it's a process.
Yeah. And it is. And I think you need to give yourself a break, and because there's a lot to learn along the way. Even though we may be a good fit, we might have the skill set, we might have a little bit of experience. In order to make a transition, it takes time, and you need to think things through and know what your values are, know what your goals are, so that you can kind of bounce every step that you take against what your values and goals are, to make sure that, like you said it earlier, it aligns with where you want to be and where you're going. And that is really important. Well, thank you so much, Whitney. This has been really great. I mean, we could probably go on and on.
I know.
Because one thing takes us to another.
It's such a great topic.
Yeah. But thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your career story, giving us some tips about just take the chance. Just why not? You're going to be so happy that you did. So just take some of these very small steps and once you start to build on those, you will start to feel more confident, and you will take larger steps down the road. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Happy New Year, everyone. And I hope that 2023 brings all of the things that you truly want. And I hope that you try some of these suggestions that Whitney suggested today about manifesting your unique purpose. I would love to hear from you and what your results show. So please keep in touch. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoy the podcast, please let us know. Write a review, share it with a friend, or on social media. Until next time, be kind, everyone. We need to show a lot more kindness in the world, and it starts with you and I. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.